Hello everybody, and thanks for joining us today. So code use in Donman, very broad subject of course. There's quite a few different sorts of codes that you can use in your database. But what we're trying to highlight today is how we can structure codes better in order to be able to manage the database and extract details that we're wanting to for particular lists or whatever we might be doing without having to fight too deeply. Because the whole basis of a database is keeping a collection of information together so that it's organized and can be easily accessed, managed, and updated. If our coding structure is very poor, then that's not going to be the end result of what we're going to achieve there. We're going to be sort of trying to say, I'm looking for this list of people or this list of people, etc. But because my coding is not very tidy, I'm going to have a bit of a struggle with that. Yeah. So what codes are available? There are numerous codes available because just on the donor screen itself, we'll go through the actual donor screen today and highlight some of the codes and look at structure and things like that. We'll look at creating codes. We'll talk about structuring the codes, and you can change codes, but what we're probably going to do is cover that in the next webinar when we look at, if people say, okay, from this one, I've now got a concept or a better idea of what I should be doing with my coding, and we want to then go through and do the change of that. So changing an individual record, of course, is, very easy. You can do that on the person's records, but if we wanted to change a whole lot of codes in bulk because we just said, look, our structuring wasn't as good as it could have been, and we want to restructure the whole thing, then we can certainly do that within Donman. So if we look at the number of codes, there are 70 different standard code types available in Donman. So each of these code types can have an endless variety of individual codes. So what I was saying before, so the list you can sort of see here, but not very clearly, is because there's just so many different sorts of codes that we can use in the database to be able to identify different sorts of records. Okay, so donor records themselves have 14 different codes, 8 extra codes available for each donor's use. So there are quite a number of codes, and obviously we can do that very well and have great structure and things like that, or we can do it where it's not the best and it's going to fight us every way when we're trying to pull a list of people out. Okay, so with all of these codes available, of course, structuring them to be meaningful is vital for good database management. Structure your codes to suit how you need to extract the data later. So there may be codes as an individual organization that you have that other people don't use because it doesn't suit their business model or the type of organization that they are. So what we're going to show is more of a guide for a general organization where we're saying, when I create a donor and I want to create codes, etc., what sort of things can I put in there? So if we were to start with one of the very important codes on a donor record, which is the donor type or the category code. So when we go through, sometimes you'll see that people sort of micromanage at this level. So instead of having, a single code for a donor category for, say, clubs or government, etc., I might have something like this list here where I've got Apex Club, I've got board members, I've got church, I've got community groups, I've got corporate, I've got doctors, estates, golf clubs, different sorts of government records, all the way down, so you can have quite a few different codes in here. When I go to then extract my data, in the case of here where I've got the school and I've got SCHL at the beginning of them, I could still find all of those records because they all start with the same thing. So I could do SCHL and an asterisk when I'm doing my search. But normally when I see this sort of coding at an organization, it'll be the other way around. So it'll be, PRI, prim school or mid school or senior school. So it'll be the way we, speak and the way we talk about it is how it would be entered in the database, which of course doesn't help us when we're trying to pull the list out, because instead of now having one umbrella code that I can use to go through and say, I'm looking for, this group of people or this group of records, I've now got to choose a number of codes in order to make sure that I've encapsulated my whole group. Yeah. So in order to sort of get away from having that many codes, what we can do is go through and we can restructure a bit. So what we might then have from that original list of codes is to go through and say, well, what are my bigger categories? So if I had something like, sorry, my Excel's just refusing to position itself where I wanted. Okay, so I'll just move this one in. Okay, so you can see here, I've sort of said, let's look at the higher level of how I'm going to put records in. So based on the previous list, I'm saying, look, I'm going to have business records, which is basically any sort of company, business, small business, corporate records, whatever it may be. Clubs and associations, community groups, etc. Education, which will cover your school, your TAFE, your unis, all of those sorts of things. So I might have this sort of list as my categories. To do subcategories, or different ways of identifying people, then some of the codes that I've got on the first list here, so the yellow ones you can see, all, for most purposes, would fit under these lists here. So I could say these are my individuals. So a board member would still be an individual, but I want to know that they're a board member. So that would then take me to where I'd start utilizing extra codes to say, I can now put the person in and say they're an individual, but they also happen to be a board member. Or as you can see here, I've got doctor, nurse, staff member, volunteer, any of those things. So the extra codes allows us to sort of create subcategories. The same with clubs and associations. Instead of having a whole lot of different codes over here where I've got my donor types, I might go through and say, look, what I want to do is make that a little bit tidier. So I want to be able to go through, and instead of having, golf clubs here and Lions clubs and Rotary clubs, etc., I could put them all under the one code of club or association. And then in the extra codes, I can create all the different sorts of clubs that I might have. That allows me to choose or exclude my groups, my clubs or associations as one group. So I've now got the umbrella code over them. Or if I use the extra codes, I can pull out a particular subgroup of club or association. So because each record has, as we were saying before, 8 extra codes, you can put numerous codes on there. So you might have somebody, of course, who's a board member. They may also be involved in other ways. So we might then have 3 or 4 codes in the extra code category, but under the one donor type. So the better we can sort of do this, everything else sort of flows. The same principle goes through as we go through and we look at things like mail codes and source codes and things like that. It's just be mindful how we need to actually extract the data later or use the data, because that's paramount to making the decisions about how I should structure the database in the first place. So I don't want to sort of get to the point where I've got, small business and corporate and, medium business or large business and things like that. And then when people are entering it, they're going to go, I don't know what sort of organization this one is I'm entering. So they'll end up with the wrong coding. So the better we can sort of do those umbrellas, the better you'll sort of see structure, come into play as far as that goes. So if we go from here and then look at a donor record, and we'll look at the different codes that we go through when we create a donor, and I'll explain some of them as we go through. Okay. So on the donor's record, because we can find people any way at all, we can find them in multi-find by number, etc. But once I've got a donor on the record, the very first field, title, is a coded field, but it is rather unique. If I have a title that I put in that isn't in the system already, the system will then come up and say, oh, do you want to add this to your list of titles? So sometimes, that'll happen where we put something in and go, oh, gosh, I've put in the wrong thing. So if I put in something like, and then my capitals, general, I'll get a message like this saying, title's not in your this is not in your general list of titles. Do you want to add that? So I could then say yes, and that's now automatically added as part of my list. But you can see I've also got Jen. So now I've got Jen and General, and I'm sort of falling into that same sort of trap where I'm not, being very mindful for having one code or one way of identifying the record. So when I want to pull the data, I've now got 2, or maybe more codes that I'm utilizing to put those in. So it's all about consistency. It's the key for running a database for all purposes. Most of the other codes you'll see on the screen are indicated by the field being in red. So we've got like our donor types, Our suburb is part of a coded file which comes from the postcode file. Our mail code. Okay, no. Okay. The next one down in the system is called user code. So in this case, I've renamed it to Why No Mail, which means if I put a donor as a no mail donor here, I can then put a reason in. Okay. So we'll go through this screen and I'll explain some of these codes a little bit better as we go through. So as I go through and try and get to donor type, I can only use what's on the drop-down list here. Okay, so I haven't got an option like I have with title to create a code on the fly. Now that's just not an option that's available. If I need to create a new code, Murray will go through after I've been through the donor screen and show you where you can actually go through and create new codes. The difference with this particular code is that when you look at the code, you then have the description, and the last column's got either a C or an S in it. So you can see in this case, apart from individuals, all of the other records are some sort of organization. So they're all got C for company. It indicates is that when I put a record in, the sort key field here is generated based on either the surname and the first four initials of the first name, as you can see here in the anonymous, okay, or it'll be based on the beginning of the company name. What the system also does in the background is create a code called SoundX, which is what we use for duplicate checking. So if I put, Annie Smith and Annie Smythe, and they're both in the same postcode, the system will at least alert me that there's a potential duplicate in my database. When I do reports or receipting, this field is also indicating to the system to use either the organization name or the person's name to put on the report. So I may, in some cases, have the same individual name up the top of the screen here, but one may be the individual's record and have a different address here, and the other one may have the person as, their role at a particular organization, where the donor type then would be one of my organizational type codes. Okay. So that will then go through automatically. Okay. So the next code down is the, yes. So because I've played with the record, it's asking me to update it. Okay, and you can see it's now changed the citation. Okay. So the suburb again is a drop-down list. And you can see there I've got my suburb, state, postcode, and the last number here is just the pre-sort number, which is the mail centre number used by Australia Post. If I try and put a postcode combination in that doesn't match, the system will alert me that that's not in my postcode file, and I can go through. If you're using the RAT tool or QAS to do address validation and barcoding, then that will go through, and you'll also then, as you go through, get this DPID number. Okay. So from there we have a few text fields as we go through, and the next one down is the mail code. So this is used one of two different ways depending on how your system's set up and how you want to utilize it. If I look at my mail code here, at the moment I've got no mail on list and I've got one called test 1. If my mailing mechanisms were fairly small and limited and I didn't have a whole lot of different ways that I want to send out mail, then in this list here I might have mail that says this person gets the newsletter, they get appeals, they get invites to events, they get things like this. But what it means is I can only have one of these codes available. So when I put a code in, I get people that say, oh, can you just send me stuff at tax time and Christmas? So now I've got to create a hybrid code that says, tax Xmas or something like that. And then I'll get tax and newsletter, and I'll get, Christmas and newsletter. So I end up with a whole lot of codes again that sort of start to get unwieldy as far as me pulling the data out later, because I now have to go through and make sure that I choose every one of those codes at this time of year, say for tax. So I'd have to make sure every code that had something to do with tax would be selected when I do my appeal selection. Very easy to miss one, of course. Okay. So in order to get around that problem, what we built into the system was this list. We're not going to go into great detail of this today. It's more just to be aware that if I'm using the mail code like here and just saying, look, the person's on, or they don't get mail, that's pretty much all that becomes my mail code. But then in my list, I can have as many different individual distribution lists basically that I want to use, and people can be on one list or more. So if I said I want to add this person to the spring and winter list, I can now just do that and go through. Okay. So these are used in conjunction, but normally you'd use one method or the other. So we'd either use the mailing code as the main thing to identify, or we'd use the list. Using a combination of them can be very confusing. So, you know, when people put the data in, they may be saying, oh, hold on, I've identified these records this way, and, you know, somebody else has put them in using the list. So normally I'd recommend to people do one way or the other. Try not to mix them unless you're really on the ball or you've got very good instructions on how to pull that out. Okay. The next one down, as I said, in the system called user code, you can rename that. The other fields that you can rename on the screen and use for your own purpose would be up the very top here. We've got user number, so that can be renamed, and it's basically just an open text field. Okay, so alphanumeric can be used for whatever you like. Okay. As we go down, I've got user code 2 under the membership code here, and I've got one here called MKT, which can be used for anything at all. Okay. As I get to those codes, I'll explain what they do a bit better. So again, any of the codes are the same. I can click on there, have my list of codes, and I can use those. You'll notice on this particular one, I've got a blank code, which basically says no user code. The 3 codes on the system I wouldn't want to have a blank on, and Murray will go through this, you know, when he looks at creating codes, is the donor type. So when I put a new record in, I always want to know it into my structure. My mail code would be the next one, because I want to know, are they going to receive correspondence from me, yes or no, and then what sort of correspondence. And the third one that you wouldn't have a blank on would be the donor source, because when I put a record in, I want to be able to identify where it came from. Okay. So as we go through, so I've got the 10 mail code, the donor source being our next one. Okay. And you can see in this case here, there isn't a blank record. Okay, so I can't put no donor source on a donor. If perchance I do, or I try, and enter, the system's telling me there's no such code. So it's forcing me to put something in. If we accidentally create a blank code, the system will see that it's a legitimate value and will then let that through. So we have to be a little bit careful with how we put, you know, add new codes. If you've got membership, then member yes, and then I can have, again, different membership codes. Okay, so the codes are created by the organization and maintained, so they're only to help, you know, you identify the records more than anything else. There's no preset codes in Donman at all. There are some that, you know, we will probably recommend, like before where I was looking at the different donor categories, but for all purposes it's to suit exactly how you want to identify the records. Okay. The next 2 codes down, the user code, can be renamed and used as just a code for your own purposes. Okay, so in this case it's basically got different religious codes in there. You can use it for anything at all and just rename it. Okay. The marketing, the one I've got here is MKT for marketing, can be used as a standalone code, so I can just have it as a code where I've got a yes-no field and it then has a value that goes in there. I can also use this code a little bit uniquely than any other code on the donor record. If perchance I've wanted to do regionalization of the database, and based on different postcodes and different postcode areas or ranges, I can set up what's called the branch file in Donman, and then I can automate this as I go through. So then this code then may be called region. I can say this person is part of my region, and based on the postcode, the system will automatically then assign the code to them. Okay, so you don't have to use it that way, but it is an option that's available. Okay. You could just have, like in here you can see I've got donate, or I've got in mem, or I've got raffle. So you can have different codes in here, but you wouldn't use it, and you couldn't use it for both purposes. It can be used for one or the other. Okay. So as we go through, we then get to our extra codes. Sorry, I missed one. Okay. Gift in kind codes. Okay. So if I say yes to the gift in kind code, will put me into the field below that, and this I would then have a list of codes to say what sort of things the person, you know, gives us in kind. So at this point here, it's fairly generic, you know, like they give goods, services, whatever it might be. When we record a gift in kind itself in Donman, we can record it like a normal batch and say it's a kind batch. The difference being that Donman won't at that point allow me to put a dollar amount in. So I can put in and it will show in the person's history but the pay method will show us kind, and there'll be no actual dollar amount in the dollar column, and that prevents it from, coming up when I'm doing my financial reporting. So I don't want things to, suddenly creep up. Then we get down to our extra codes, and this is where your list of codes could be very long. So you can see here, this is where I've started to put things like Apex Club and board members. I might have committee members, ex-board, ex-staff, whatever it may be. This list of codes could be 200 long. It really doesn't matter. It's just because it doesn't have a structure where code 1 is equal one thing and code 2 is equal something else. It's basically a list of codes that I can choose from this, broader list here, and I can attach 8 of these individual codes to each donor record on the system. I can then use those in conjunction with any of the other codes on the system or data on the system to extract a list of people as I go through. Okay. So they're the codes on the main screen, and this is the screen that primarily people look at. So this is the one we see every day. As we go through, the very top of the donor screen, the second screen of the donor screen, it's got a refer to code. So in this case, I've got a code in there of bequest, but it may be something else. So it may be a person, it may be a position. It's really just saying if I've got, in this case, I've got a bequest officer, and they would then want to do appointments for people and things like that, then I can put the refer to code in here. This automatically becomes part of my donation processing cycle. So this code will go from the donor record to the donation processing screen, and one of the reports I'd have to print out would be the refer to code. So if this particular bequest officer was looking after some donors and they've made a donation, I can alert them that, one of the donors under their wing basically has made a donation, and they may then do a more personal thank you or, ring them, whatever they want to do. Under the next appointment date here, there's job male and job female. Okay. So this would be in the case where I might have a doctor or I've got, things, and it depends on, of course, if you want to record these details. But the list of codes, again, can be quite large. Okay. So I can have, as many codes as I want to identify how I'm capturing the data. But again, these are two fields that we can use if I wanted to go through and I, within an organization that dealt with physiotherapists or, different people in the health area, and I wanted to say, look, I just want to, have something that identifies them and pull out that list of people. Then I don't need to go back to the front screen and say, doctor and nurse and physio and, all of those things there. I'm still saying, as a broader category, this person still fits under my donor type as an individual, but I'm now putting in a code to say this is, the occupation that they have, so I can utilize that later. Yeah. So they're the primary codes as we go through. The last of the codes on the screen is this one here just under bank called user code 3. Again, it can be renamed in the system, and you can create a list of codes in the drop-down here to suit what you're using it for. It's not used by a lot of organizations because they don't see it. So as people who've used Donman for a while will tell you, unless you're wanting to look at something specific on this second page of the donor record, it's not something that you stop at a whole lot. So you'll skip it a whole lot. But it is a code, just like the others on the main screen, that you can rename, create a list of codes in there, and you can use that to pull a list of people out based on this code, or again, combinations of this code and other details on the donor's record. Okay. So they're the primary codes as we go through, and really if we go back to the front screen, it's really just saying, have some good structure. So like I showed on the Excel file before, just think about how the coding goes in. So there may be special categories or things that as an organization are important to you, and as such you'd say, yes, I want to have those. But if you've got a very low number of records that have got those codes, then you might consider, using that code somewhere else, because it's not worth having something at the high level like this donor type here, where you only had 1 or 2 records out of your whole database that were using those codes. That's sort of a little bit of an overkill to say, oh, now I've got, all of these sort of subcodes and my database becomes top heavy because I've got way too many codes at the top level here, and I want to sort of pull that back in so that I can sort of start, building umbrellas. I mean, as I normally explain to people, if you think of the database is at the end of the day like an electronic filing cabinet. So when I'm creating my drawers, I don't want to go through and have, something that's got 50 different drawers in it. I want to have, the minimum number of drawers, but within that I've got different dividers. So then that's where we start using, all of the other codes to say they're basically the electronic version of my dividers that I'd have in the filing cabinet. So I can still have a drawer for individuals, but then have a subset for those so they can say, look, people fit within those. So hopefully that sort of highlighted a little bit or showed you a little bit of how, the coding can be structured, and if yours isn't like that, it can be. So it is not that hard to change, and as I said, when we do the next webinar, that's something we'll be looking at a little bit further is, not just setting up your new codes, but then restructuring your file and your database to suit how you want to identify them. So I'll hand over to Murray now, and he'll show you where you can actually go and create these codes and do some reporting and things.
Hi everybody. As Gary said, I'm going to take you through the process of actually how to create or edit the existing codes that you've got. Now, as he showed you on one of his earlier screens, we do have a large number of codes that are used throughout the system. Some of those are used by, say, the university or the school system, so most of you probably won't come across those. But once we know how to actually update one code, you pretty much know how to update all of those codes. It's just a matter of knowing whereabouts to go for those codes. For instance, if we were updating a code from the pledge screen, we would need to go to the pledge system. If it's in memoriam, we would go to the in memoriam system. However, today we're dealing with just those records that are on the donor screen. Now, to do those, what we need to do is they're all in the one place, essentially, and to get there, we go to our housekeeping menu. Now, on the far left-hand side there, right at the top, we see donor descriptive codes. So originally, all of our codes were in this one menu, but as we added more and more codes, we couldn't squeeze them all into the one menu. So we also have an additional code menu over here. On some of your menus, that might actually say other codes, or it might say additional code menu. But essentially, the remaining codes that you need for your Donman, or for your donor screen or donor record will be in one of these two codes. Now, what I'll be dealing with here are those things that actually are part of the codes file. So there are a few things that we describe as a code. For instance, Gary mentioned the suburb postcode file. You've also got things like the campaign code. Those I won't actually be covering today unless there's a bit of time or if there's a question about it. For things like those postcode file, in the housekeeping menu itself, you've got this postcode suburb file edit. So if you found that there was a new combination, perhaps a new suburb, or an existing suburb changed its postcode, you'd be able to go into that postcode suburb file edit here and actually modify or add any other codes. However, as I mentioned, we're just going to be dealing mainly with those codes that are part of the codes file, those 71, I think it was, that Gary said he mentioned. So the main ones that you see on the donor screen that Gary has gone through, you see here on the donor descriptive codes menu. Now, before I get into any of these in particular, one thing to note is, generally speaking, on the donor record, most of the codes, if not all, are up to 8 alphanumeric characters. The title, that's what we call a soft-coded code, and that is actually quite different. So that one can actually be up to 50 characters long. Throughout other parts of the system, things like the ledger codes can be up to 16 characters, whereas contact codes are single characters. But as I said, in here on the donor record, most, if not all, are going to be 8 characters. And if you try and put in more than 8, it'll actually warn you. Or if there's only 4 characters for something like an interest code on the trust, it'll tell you that you're going for too many characters. Now, before we get into any of these, where we had some of those renamable renamable fields, you'll notice in here they're also renamed. So for something like this one, sport codes, that would actually be on my donor screen it would show as sport codes, but it's actually known internally as user code. And if we were actually to go into it, we would actually see at the top the actual code name itself. Let's start with having a look at the donor type, because that is probably the most important code that's on the donor record. As Gary mentioned, it uses that to work out what the sort key is, but more importantly, it uses that when it does a duplicate check or when it's doing things like a receipt. It'll choose whether to use the surname or the company as the main name. I've gone into that, and for most codes, you will see a field for the code itself, a description, and then the archive and display. And I'll just explain what those ones are. But for the few codes where there is an extra question, you've got this extra box here, in this case for the category code or the donor type. We're asking whether for that donor type, should it use the surname or the company. For others, like extra codes, there is the ability to actually colour the background fields on a donor record to stand out for particular extra codes. So you might have an extra code for major donor, and you want that to stand out so that if someone brings up that record, it'll suddenly appear on the screen with a certain coloured background, and you'll know, hang on, I better treat that a little bit special, or maybe I'll pass that to my major donor officer or somebody who would treat that specially. So for most codes, you won't have an extra question here, but for this one we do. Now we can look at what's currently in there simply by clicking on the ... button there. Now Gary mentioned and showed you on his system how there was no blank there. You'll see here on my one, I've actually put this deliberate blank record. So what that means is if I'm creating a new record, I could simply enter over that field and leave it blank. And it will actually say, oh yes, I will use the surname in that case. Now, that's not a good thing to do, as Gary has described, because we need to know whether it's actually the donor is the individual or the company. And if you have to go back 6 months later to look at a record that's got no donor type there and try and work out if it's a corporate record or if it's an individual, it's going to be pretty tough if there is both a surname and a company. So that's why we need to get rid of that. However, let's say we want to create a new donor type there called XYZ for whatever purpose that is. So on a blank screen, we simply type in XYZ, and even though you'll see that I've typed it in lowercase, all codes throughout the system are uppercase apart from the title. So in this case, when I press enter, it will simply uppercase it for me, and that's the way that it should be. So the description could be Murray's test code, something like that. Now, when I come down to the archive code, it defaults to no. When we archive a code, what it means is that code is still a valid code, and any donor record that contains that code is still allowed to keep it. However, for any new donor record or for an existing one that you want to change, you will not be able to change it to that particular code. So when you're first creating one, it would be pretty silly to make it archive yes, because then you could never use that particular code. So by default it comes up as a no, but there may be times where you wish to say, yes, I want to archive that, in which case you could simply select it from the drop-down list and say, yes, I want to archive it. Such a situation might be, let's say you have a ball every year and you want to record which of your donors you've effectively acquired through the ball. So you may have a source code that says ball 2015, another for ball 2016, ball 2017, etc. Once your ball is over for say 2015 and you've entered all the new donors that you've acquired through that particular event, then you could actually come in and archive it so that you couldn't accidentally assign that code to somebody, because by the time you come to 2016 and you've created a ball 2016 code, that's the one that you want to use. You don't want them to actually use the code from last year. Now the next option we have here is display in a pop-up list. So when we click on a drop-down list, like either up in here or as Gary was doing on the donor screen, then if you don't want it shown there, we can simply say no. And by doing that, then it doesn't confuse the list. So especially if you've archived a code that you can no longer use, typically you would probably say, no, I don't want to display that at the same time. Okay. Now, in the case of the donor type or category code, we need to say whether XYZ donors should be using their surname or their company. So I'm going to say company. I just press enter. I press enter to save, and that is there. I can very simply check. I can see that that's there at the bottom now. Let's suppose I've now assigned that to 20 different donors across the period of time, and I say, okay, we don't want to be able to use that anymore. I can bring it up on the screen. I just double-clicked it, or you could have pressed enter. It brought it up. I'm now going to say, yes, I want to archive that, and no, I don't want to display that. If I now look at my drop-down list, it won't be there. However, those 20 donor records that I've assigned that code to can still keep that. If I want to delete a code, I can say, oh yeah, look, I don't want hospital supplies. So I can click on that, bring it up on the screen, and by simply doing Shift F6, which is the general delete key combination for Donman, that has now been deleted. And if I look at the drop-down list there, it is now gone. The difference between doing that and archiving it is that if I were to bring up one of those donors that had that as a donor type, as soon as I tried to press enter on the S or whatever the code was, it would say that's no longer a valid code, and I would need to actually change that to something else, maybe corporate or company, business, something along those lines. So you shouldn't really delete any codes unless you know for a certainty that none of your donors have got that. Now, next month in our webinar, we're going to be covering how to do a bulk change. So typically what we would do is we would say, okay, I want to change from this existing code maybe to corporate, and I could get it to go through the whole of my donor database and pull out anyone that's got that code and change it to the one that I want to. Having then done that, I know that there are no donors with that code, and I could then delete that. Obviously, the alternative is you could archive it and make it non-display. Now, I've got a code in there called XYZ. If I look at the drop-down list, I can't select it, but I can type it in and press F3. Oh, well, that's it. I should have done that in uppercase. That would probably help. And F3, and that's now brought it up. Alternatively, I can actually just page down through all of the codes that are in there, and it will bring up all of the ones that are there, whether they're archived and non-display or not. In my case, I know that I haven't actually assigned that to anyone, so again, I can just do a Shift F6. Now, the blank record is a special case. When we're on this drop-down list here, I can double-click on it, and you can see that it's brought up nothing. I'll try again. I'll hit Enter. Again, nothing. And I can just click on OK, still nothing. It's just because of that control box doesn't allow me to select blanks. So the easiest way to delete a blank record, a blank code, is simply to press F3. F3 is the find. You can now see that I've actually brought it up. Let me try that again. If I do F12 to clear the screen and I pretend or think that I brought it up, if I don't realize that I haven't, when I do my Shift F6, let me get out of here and go back in because unfortunately the little message was overlaying itself. So I'll pretend to bring it up again. I'll do my Shift F6 and you can see down the bottom it's got an error message, no record in memory to delete codes. So what it means is I haven't actually been able to bring it into the system, into the memory, so that I can delete it, and that's where I only use that F3. Now that I've got that, I can do my Shift F6, and then if I look at my drop-down list, it's gone. Now, in theory, again, I should have looked to see if there were any donors that had no source key, no donor type, and I could have then done a bulk update, and then once I'd done that, I could then delete it. A different way of doing it, and I won't go through this today, is you could simply set a filter in your donor screen and page down and just go one by one and work out what the code should be, because maybe some of them should be companies, some should be this, some should be that. So for something like this, it would be a lot harder to just bulk change them to one particular code, because they could be one of any number. So that's the donor type, or in this case, category code. We've got the mail frequency, or the mail code. So again, there's nothing particularly special there. The only special one out of all these, as Gary mentioned, was the no mail one. So we've got the auxiliary codes. Now, again, on here there's nothing special, but as Gary mentioned, the auxiliary code you can actually have determined by the system based on the postcode. The other advantage of the auxiliary code is it will actually store, when a person makes a donation, it stores the current value of their auxiliary code onto the donation record. So if you do use it as a regional based one, if someone was part of, say, Gippsland and they made some donations, then those donations would show as Gippsland. If they then moved to Melbourne Metro, any new donations would come up as Melbourne Metro, but the original ones given as part of Gippsland would remain as part of Gippsland. Okay, so most of these other codes are fairly straightforward. I'll come back to extra codes briefly. This one, sport code, as I said, was user code. When I actually go into there, you can see up the top, the internal name is user code, but on the menu here, and also on the actual donor screen, it comes up as sport. Okay, now extra codes is a little bit special as well in that it has an extra question. So again, we've got the code, the description, we've got the yes and no for the archive and the display, and then we've got this extra question here. If we have a look at our drop-down list, you can see we've got some codes there, major donor, hospital, etc., and we can see that one of these ones, the major donor, is being given a colour number of 3. So the colours themselves need to be set up separately, but these are done as a number, and then we assign that number to any particular code that we want. So when we actually have a look at that, that's actually under this additional codes menu. So most of these things here you will have seen on the donor screen. A couple of these are parts of other records like the involvement record, pledge records, things like that. Here we've got second address records, contact records, occupation codes that Gary showed you on the second donor screen. Relationships come up when you use the relationship button. And we've got this option here for print code list. So if we go into that, we've got the option of selecting particular codes. So if I only wanted to get a list of my donor types and say, so that's category, so I can pick category from here. Where are you? Category. And then perhaps I would want maybe source codes. Okay. If you leave it blank, then you're going to get every single code, of which there is, I think it was 71, Gary said. Now, some of those may not have any defined values for them, but they're still going to come up. We also have the ability here to say, do we only want to see the archived codes? Do we want to see just the non-archived codes, or we don't care? So if we want to see them all, we can just use blank on those. So I can just do a print preview here. And that's now giving me a list of the codes. And for the donor types, you can actually see that extra little question at the end there. If we had done extra codes, we would see the same thing. Okay. So under the additional codes menu, country codes, if you tick the box on the donor record to put it into an overseas address, then you need to set up the country codes. But you should find that if you've got that, you've probably got pretty much every single one that are there, unless there's some new ones being added recently. Code pool we're not actually covering. I think we've done that in the previous webinar. Highlighting colours, so this is where we can set up those colours for use with those extra codes. So if we have a look at the moment, we've got 3 or 4 set up. So if I want to set up a new one, I can just simply go, I want to call this number 5, and I just choose the colour. Now it's actually a combination of both the foreground and the background colour, so I can just page through a whole lot of these different things and go, yeah, I actually like the yellow on the red background, I'll choose that. Puts in the colour, description, and that's now saved away, so I can now use that as one of my highlighting colors on a donor record. Okay, here's where we do our title codes, and when you go into this, what you might find is some really strange ones. Well, here's one, +6 misses, 9 Ms. What you might also find is things like Mr. in all uppercase. And the problem with that is that if you've got Mr. in all uppercase and then you accidentally type that in again when you're doing a new one, it will accept it because it's already a defined code. So I would suggest that you have a look at your title codes and see if there are any there that you can delete. And it's clearly in this set here, there are many that you can delete. If you don't have that on your actual menu, then you probably just need to log a support request and we can add that to your menu for you. Now, there's a couple of reports that I want to show you. One of those ones here is this code check report, and this is very useful for trying to find any codes that are being used somewhere throughout the system that are not actually no longer defined. So someone's deleted a code when there are donors that have that. So there's no options here apart from where I want to print it. It's going to go through all of my donors. It's going to go through archive, donations, prospects, pretty much every record in the system that has some form of code on it. So what you'll probably notice is that there's going to be a large number, and when you run this for the first, well, when you run it any time, it's actually going to have a large number of records probably coming up unless you've got a very clean database, and it will take quite a while. Obviously, the more records of every type that you've got, the slower it's going to be. So just looking at what we've got here for donors, and that's just this first section here, you've got category types here, you've got a blank, so we've got 2 donors with a blank record, we've got 40 with a code of F, we've got 3 with a code of rubbish, 2 with a code of S, and then, because that was the one that I deleted, we've got an extra code of board that's been removed, and 5 people have got that, and then we've got some source codes there. So we've got 433 records or problems with our donor file alone. And then obviously down below we've got all the different files there that possibly may have some problems. Looks like we've got a big problem with our campaign file as well. So that's the first report, and I would advise everybody to go and run that straight away. Just do it a print to the screen and just have a look and see whether you've got a big problem, a little problem, or perhaps, if you're lucky, nothing at all. And the last report that I'm going to show you is under the reports menu. And I think I've shown this report before for other reasons, but it's under the statistical reports menu. It's called the general item breakdown by dollar. And what this will allow us to do is get a breakdown of our donor file based on any selected field from the list of all fields. So it's not just the coded fields, it's any field at all. But let me go in and find the donor type field. So if I do a report on that, it does give me some financial information. I'll just use today's date and don't care about what campaigns, because that's not really what we're about today. But if I do a print preview on that, it's going to run through all of my donors, split it up based on the donor type, and give me a list of all of those donor types, including any that are no longer defined to the system. So straight away, we can see over here that the first code is blank. It has the word no description simply because it's no longer a defined code. We also have rubbish and S as well in the same boat, and F. Now these of course equate to those same 4 that came up on that code check report. If we look right to the final field or column, we've got the number of donors that fit into each of those particular codes. So it gives you a good idea, and you can see here the majority of our donors are under this code here of individuals. But if we look at the actual donations in the last 12 months, you can actually see that more money came from companies from just 24 donations than did from 382 donations from individuals. I won't actually go into any more detail here because you can look all of this up in the manual. It'll give you a sample and explain what all of these fields are. There is one last little thing that I will show you that may be of some interest at particular points in time. If we go into Visual Reporter and we generate a report, say, on the donor file, if I want to do a report, say, of all my donor types that are, say, individual or whatever, I'm not really sure of what the code is, perhaps. So what I can do is if I click on donor type and go OK, I'll say equals. When I come in here, if I'm not really sure what the code is that I need, I can simply click on the question mark, and it will run through all of my donors and give me a breakdown of all the codes in use, including these deleted ones, and give me a count. So if I'm looking for individual, yes, it's I double click that, and that then sets up my criteria. So that's where I'm going to leave it at this stage. So I'm going to pass back to Marla now for any questions that we might have.
Thanks, Murray. I think we got it, but I just quickly on the area you were in now, can you just show how you get to those reports that you went through, how you navigate to them?
Sure. Okay. So, yeah, sorry, I wasn't terribly explanatory there. First of all, to go to the general item breakdown by dollar, we go to the reports menu, and then statistical reports, the top one there, and it's the very first one, the general item breakdown by dollar. So that's where we go in. And the other one, if I go back to our start menu, again we go to reports, then we go to reporter. Now on yours it might say VisRep, it might say visual reporter, it might say visual report writer. It's all the same. I've got two here now for both of those. Either of those is VisRep as we abbreviate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Murray. So just a reminder to everyone, if you do have any questions, we do have a little bit of time left today to run through them. There's a few posted already, which we'll go through now. But if you do have a question, just type it in the question pane to the right of the viewer window, click on send, and that'll come to me and I can read them out, and hopefully Gary and Murray can assist us. So just going back a little bit, I think it was back to Gary's section, a question from Georgie. Can you use the involved tab for, say, major donors, etc., as it has a date from and a date to, where extra codes don't?
Yes, you can.
Well, I'll answer that.
Yep.
Oh, do you want to answer, Gary?
No, you've got the screen, so it's easier.
Oh, okay. All right. Right. Okay. So the one thing about the involved is that the information under here is not actually, we don't have anything set up on this system, but they're not actually part of the donor screen. They're actually part of the involved database. So some things that you can do with codes on the screen, like if you wanted to output something from a selection file, you'd be able to output any codes on the donor screen itself, but on the involved screen, you wouldn't be able to do that from a selection file. You'd really only be able to do that probably from a visual reporter report. So there are advantages. There are other places that you can do that. I mean, I won't go into too much detail, but again, with CodePool, if I click on Add, you've got a date there, just a single date, but that could be of some use to you. Also, if it's for major donors or something along those lines, you've actually got the bequest field here, because this is actually for your top donors and or your bequest prospects. So you've got some information that you can record in here as well. So there's probably a few different areas. Quite often, if you find that you're trying to use more than 8 extra codes, CodePool is an excellent area. I often use an example of if you were an organisation that kept track of persons' allergies. Some people might have more than 8 allergies. Well, you can't use extra codes to record those, but you could use CodePool to do that. But again, we have covered, I believe, CodePool in a previous webinar. If it's something of interest, maybe we can do another one on that down the line.
Okay. Thanks, Murray. A question from Craig. How do you use flag 1 and flag 2?
Flag 1 and flag 2 are not what we classify as coded fields, but again, these can simply be renamed to anything that we like with a certain character limit there. So we could say married, and then the next one might, if you're a hospital, you could say past patient or something along those lines, but they are simply yes or no questions. You can't just type anything you like there. No, it needs to be either a yes or a no. Now, you can do that one by one, or there are some options in the donor appeals menu where you can bulk update those flags. So you can use those either as a temporary thing, just say, oh yeah, look, I want to flag all of these people that have responded to my survey or something like that. We just set the flag 1, and then you could use that to pull up a selection file and then send something out to those people, or maybe you could set flag 1 just to say, I want to archive this person. So you get a whole lot of mail back at your tax time, and you might rename flag 1 to say archive, although you could do something similar with extra codes as well. So they're fairly flexible in what you can do. As I said, you could say, pull up a selection file of everyone with a flag 1 with a yes or a no. We have bulk updates to set them all to a yes, or to set them to a no, or to swap from a no to a yes and from a yes to a no.
Okay. Also from Craig, do you have a field for prioritising, for instance, by linkage, interest, or ability?
Well, could you read that again?
Do you have a field for prioritising, e.g. by linkage, interest, and ability? And take that offline.
Not quite sure.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe if Craig could log a support request and we can chat about that. I mean, we've got those extra codes, the user codes, sorry. So, you know, in here you could have like gold, silver, bronze if you wanted level, or 109876 for some sort of priority.
He's just saying for creating a priority for donor attention.
Yep. Well, as I said, any of those user-coded fields could be used for that. So if you were to set up a code for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or however many priority levels you wanted, you could certainly make use of that. There's not a specific coded field for it, and that's the idea of the user codes. Each different organisation can use those user code fields for whichever they like. So we've got 3 of those user codes, plus you've also got auxiliary code. I mean, if you really wanted to, if you're not currently using the user code for it, you could use that. And one of the advantages of the user code is that it is a searchable or indexed field, so you could ask for it in highest to lowest order if you wanted some report, or you can't actually do a search on one of those in the selection though, so that would be the downside to using that. You could even use the refer to field if you wanted to.
Okay, and next question was from Georgie. Can you change a donor type code in the prospect section? Is there a bulk change?
In prospects?
Yes.
In the prospect section?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe so. In the bulk utilities menu, I think we've got one for donors as well. So we've got this bulk prospect code update. So when we go through this one next month, the bulk donors code update, essentially the bulk prospect code update will do exactly the same. It's just that it'll work on the prospect system, and there are fewer coded fields on the prospect record.
Okay, and just a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. From Georgia, with the increase of variation in method to receive mail, for instance, post versus email, where would you recommend coding this?
Well, my preference would be to actually have in the mail code, rather than having a whole heap of different things like this, you could actually use that as their mail preference. So I would say there are some people that only want mail, so you'd have a code for mail, you'd have a code for email only, and then you'd have one for email and mail. And having got that, under your lists, you would then have all the various different types of mail out that you could have. So tax mail out, your Christmas mail out, newsletters, or if you wanted to be more specific, you could have like autumn newsletter, winter newsletter, summer newsletter, etc. End of year financial reports, invitation to the AGM, all of those sorts of things could then go under the mail list. And let's say you were doing your tax mail out, you would pick anybody that has got the mail list for tax appeal ticked, and then you could either output them all and put them into Excel. And if you output the mail code, you could see, well, this group of people only want it by mail, these people will get it only by email, and these can get it either way, so let's email those people. Alternatively, you could create 3 separate lists. Here's well, actually it'd be 2 lists. Here's the people that want a mail for the tax appeal. Here's the people that will accept an email for the tax appeal. So you could do it as 2 separate lists rather than having to separate them in Excel. So that would be my preference. How would you suggest, Gary?
Yeah, either that or under the mail list. So still use the mail code, one way or the other. But if you said, look, under the mail code, I still want to have just, on list or, no mail, then in the actual list button, you could have like e-news or e-appeal or things like that. So yes, you can do it one way or the other. You can use the mail code to say, here's the preference, and the list to be just the different distribution list you've got. And at the time you do the mailing, you can go through and say, I'm looking for people who've got the mail code of email who are on this mail list, and you'll get the results that you're after.
Okay, just the last question and we'll wrap it up, from Kesaya. I hope I've got the name right. How easy is it to pull a report up based on the job code?
Well, that general item breakdown that I did, I could do the same thing on the job, although you'd probably have to run one for job male and one for job female. But if I go in and run that statistical report, general item breakdown from the drop-down list here, I presume it's, actually, what is the code for that? Is it just occupation male? Yeah, occupation male?
Yeah, male and female.
I probably won't have one for that. I'll see how many I've got. One. So I don't have any others there. But while I'm on here, there is one thing. If you look for extra codes, you'll see you've got extra code 1 through to 8. But if you want a list of extra codes, no matter which one it's in, just use extra code Z, and that'll give you a list. There won't be any totals because some donors will not appear at all, and some will be up to 8 times. But you'll at least get to see what extra codes are used and by how many people. Okay, so it gives you an explanation down the bottom why there's no totals.
Alrighty, we will wrap it up there. Thank you, Murray. Thank you, Gary, for a very informative webcast and lots of good questions. So thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your afternoon to join us today. As Gary and Murray mentioned, we'll be doing another webcast along these lines next month on Tuesday the 11th of July. We'll send out details about that shortly, where we'll be looking more closely at bulk code change, I believe. So details will be sent out to you via email soon and also on our website. Now you will also find recordings of our previous webcasts on our website at donman.net.au under Resources Recorded Webcasts, or you can go straight through to the Client Support Portal where you log your tech support requests and you'll see them posted there as well. If you do have any further questions, you're more than welcome to contact us either via tech support or our main email address, which is info_donman@advsol.com. So that wraps it up. Apologies for going a little bit over this time. We look forward to speaking to you next month. Thank you so much for your time. Goodbye for now.